I never thought I'd be the kind of grandfather who'd end up terrified at a wedding. But there I was, sitting in the third row at my son Marcus's second wedding, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, organ music swelling around us, and my 5-year-old granddaughter Lily squeezing my hand so hard I thought the bones might crack. She leaned close, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered words that turned my blood to ice. "Grandpa, I want to leave now." I looked down at her pale face, those wide green eyes brimming with something I'd never seen before, pure terror, and asked what was wrong. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed one trembling finger downward and said, "Haven't you looked under the table? What could possibly be under a wedding reception table that would make a child shake like that?" Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. The morning had started so differently. I'd picked Lily up from my daughter-in-law Rachel's house around 8, her little pink dress already wrinkled from the car ride, her hair in 2 careful braids Rachel had spent 20 minutes perfecting. Lily had been chattering the whole drive about being a flower girl again, about how she got to throw petals and wear shiny shoes, about how Daddy looked so handsome in his new suit. I'd smiled and nodded, my chest tight with feelings I couldn't quite name. This was Marcus's second wedding in 3 years. His first marriage to Rachel had imploded in a mess of accusations and late-night arguments I'd tried desperately to mediate. Now here he was, marrying someone new, a woman named Vanessa I'd met exactly twice. Both times she'd smiled too widely, laughed too loud, touched Marcus's arm with a possessiveness that made my skin crawl. But I kept my mouth shut. After the divorce, Marcus had made it clear he didn't want my opinions anymore. He'd said I'd chosen Rachel's side, that I didn't understand what he'd been through, that I was too old to see things clearly. So I stayed quiet and showed up when invited, playing the role of supportive father even when every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The ceremony itself had been beautiful in that sterile, overproduced way modern weddings often are. White roses everywhere, a string quartet, vows written by some online service that sounded like greeting cards. Vanessa wore a dress so elaborate she could barely walk, layers of lace and beading that must have cost more than my first car. Marcus stood beside her looking stiff and uncomfortable, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I sat with Lily on my lap during the vows, her small body warm against my chest, her fingers playing with the buttons on my jacket. She'd been perfectly behaved, whispering only once to ask if we could get ice cream after. I'd promised we would, kissing the top of her head, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. Everything seemed fine, normal, just another family obligation to get through. Then came the reception. The venue was a restored barn on the outskirts of town, all exposed beams and Edison bulbs, long tables draped in cream-colored linens. Our assigned seats were near the back, which suited me fine. I wasn't interested in being close to the head table where Vanessa's family held court, loud and brash, already halfway through their second bottle of champagne. Lily and I found our spots, and I helped her into her chair, pushing it close to the table so she could reach her water glass. The room buzzed with conversation, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter that felt too sharp. I scanned the crowd, recognizing a few faces, Marcus's college friends, some distant cousins, people I'd seen at the first wedding and probably wouldn't see again after this one. The whole thing felt like a performance, everyone playing their parts, pretending this was joyful, when really it just felt sad and rushed. Lily had been quiet for a while, coloring on the kids' activity sheet they'd left at each place setting. I watched her work, her tongue poking out in concentration, as she carefully stayed inside the lines of a cartoon bride and groom. She was such a serious child, thoughtful in ways that surprised me. Rachel said she'd been anxious since the divorce, asking questions about why Daddy didn't live with them anymore, why Grandpa couldn't fix it. I'd tried to explain in ways a 5-year-old might understand, but how do you tell a child that sometimes people stop loving each other, that families break apart for reasons no one can fully explain? I'd failed her in that. Failed all of them, really. I should have seen the cracks in Marcus's first marriage earlier. Should have pushed harder for counseling, for communication, for anything other than the cold silence that eventually swallowed them whole. The salads arrived, and I picked at mine without appetite. Lily pushed hers away after one bite, wrinkling her nose at the balsamic vinaigrette. I didn't force it. This wasn't the kind of day to battle over vegetables. Around us, the noise level rose as alcohol flowed more freely. Vanessa's father stood and gave a rambling toast about finding love the second time around, about how his daughter deserved happiness after her own difficult first marriage. I hadn't known Vanessa had been married before. Marcus had never mentioned it. That felt significant somehow. Another piece of information kept from me. Another sign of the distance that had grown between us. I glanced toward the head table and caught Marcus's eye for just a second. He looked away immediately, his jaw tight, his hand gripping his wine glass so hard I thought it might shatter. That's when Lily grabbed my hand. At first I thought she just wanted attention, maybe needed to use the restroom or was getting bored, but her grip was desperate, painful, her little fingernails digging into my palm. I leaned down, concerned now, searching her face for signs of illness. She was pale, paler than she'd been even 5 minutes ago, and her eyes were fixed on something under the table. Her whole body had gone rigid, her breathing shallow and quick. "Grandpa, I want to leave now," she whispered, and there was such raw fear in her voice that my own heart started hammering. I asked what was wrong, trying to keep my voice calm even as panic rose in my throat. That's when she said it. Those words that changed everything. "Haven't you looked under the table?" I hadn't, why would I? But now, with Lily trembling beside me, I slowly leaned forward, bending at the waist, lifting the edge of the tablecloth. The lighting under there was dim, just shadows and the occasional flash of someone's shoes as they walked past. At first I saw nothing unusual. Table legs, discarded napkins, someone's purse. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. Tucked into the far corner, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small black duffel bag. It wasn't the bag itself that made my stomach drop. It was what was sticking out of the partially open zipper. Wires. Red and yellow wires tangled together, connected to something I couldn't fully see but recognized instantly from every news report I'd ever watched about things you should never see at a wedding. Do you think I was overreacting? Or would you have felt the same cold terror flooding through your veins? I sat back up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying not to let the scream building in my chest escape. Lily was still gripping my hand, her eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to tell her everything was okay. But I couldn't, because nothing was okay. Nothing had been okay for a long time, and now, sitting in this barn full of people I barely knew, celebrating a marriage I didn't believe in, I realized we were all in terrible danger. The question that ripped through my mind wasn't just what was in that bag. It was who put it there and why and how much time did we have before everything exploded. I've lived 68 years on this earth and faced down moments that would break most men. I held my wife's hand as cancer took her from me inch by inch. I buried my parents within 6 months of each other. I watched my son's first marriage crumble and couldn't stop it. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the paralyzing terror of seeing those wires under a wedding table while my granddaughter's tiny hand clutched mine. My mind raced through impossible choices. If I stood up and screamed, if I caused a panic, people would stampede toward the exits and someone could get trampled. If I stayed silent and was wrong about what I'd seen, I'd look like a paranoid old fool. But if I stayed silent and was right, we might all die in the next 5 minutes. The weight of that decision pressed down on my chest like a boulder, stealing my breath, making spots dance at the edges of my vision. Lily tugged on my sleeve, her voice barely audible over the clatter of silverware and drunken laughter surrounding us. "Grandpa, you saw it too, didn't you?" Her eyes searched mine for reassurance I couldn't give. I nodded slowly, my throat so dry I could barely swallow. I needed to think clearly, needed to push past the animal panic screaming at me to grab Lily and run. Instead, I forced myself to take a long, steady breath and assess the situation like the engineer I'd been for 40 years. Facts, evidence, logical steps. The bag was there. The wires were real. But I hadn't seen a timer, hadn't heard any ticking, hadn't noticed anything else that confirmed my worst fear. Maybe it was something innocent. Maybe someone had left equipment for the band or the photographer or the lighting crew. Maybe I was letting my imagination spiral because everything about this day already felt wrong. I leaned down to Lily, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "Sweetheart, I need you to do exactly what I say, okay? Can you be very brave for Grandpa?" She nodded, her braids bobbing, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes but not falling yet. "I want you to stand up very quietly and walk toward the bathroom. Don't run, just walk normally, like you really need to go. Wait for me by the door. Can you do that?" She hesitated, her lower lip trembling. "What about you?" The question almost broke me. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, was more worried about me than herself. "I'll be right behind you," I promised, though I had no idea if that was true. "I just need to check something first. Go on now. Be brave." She slipped off her chair, smoothing down her pink dress with shaking hands, and started walking toward the restrooms at the back of the barn. I watched her go, my heart in my throat, counting her steps, praying she'd make it outside before anything happened. Then I turned my attention back to the bag under the table. I had to know for certain. Had to see what we were dealing with before I made a decision that could destroy my son's wedding or save everyone's life. I slid off my own chair, pretending to drop my napkin, and ducked under the table as if retrieving it. The smell hit me first, chemical and sharp, something that definitely didn't belong at a wedding reception. My hands trembled as I reached toward the bag, every instinct screaming not to touch it. But I had to see. Had to know. If you're still with me, you won't believe what happens next. Drop a comment below with your country so I know you're here. I pulled the zipper open another 2 inches, wincing at the metallic rasp it made, though no one seemed to notice over the noise of the reception. Inside the bag, packed carefully between layers of foam, were bundles of something wrapped in plastic, connected to those wires I'd seen, connected to what looked like a cheap digital clock face reading 2:14. As I stared at those numbers, they changed to 2:13, then 2:12. My vision tunneled. My ears started ringing. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't innocent equipment. This was a bomb. A real bomb, counting down at my son's wedding, and I had just over 2 minutes to decide what to do. The napkin fell from my nerveless fingers. I backed out from under the table so fast I cracked my head on the edge, seeing stars, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. I stood up, swaying slightly, scanning the room with new eyes. Who would do this? Who would bring a bomb to a wedding? My gaze swept across the guests, lingering on faces I didn't recognize, looking for anyone who seemed out of place, anyone watching the table with unusual interest. Vanessa's family dominated the head table, loud and celebratory, oblivious. Marcus sat stiffly beside his new wife, his expression unreadable. Then I saw him. A man I'd noticed earlier but dismissed, standing near the barn's main entrance, not sitting at any table, not eating or drinking or socializing. He wore a dark jacket despite the warm afternoon, and his eyes were locked directly on me. The moment our gazes met, his expression changed. Recognition. Then something worse. Satisfaction. He reached into his jacket pocket and every muscle in my body coiled to run. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone, held it up so I could see the screen, and mouthed 2 words I could read clearly even across the crowded room. 2 minutes. Then he smiled, turned, and walked out the door as casually as if he were stepping out for a cigarette. My brain finally kicked into gear. I didn't have time to find security, didn't have time to explain or convince anyone. I had one option, the only option that made any sense in the 90 seconds I had left. I started moving toward the head table, pushing past guests who shot me annoyed looks, ignoring the photographer who tried to stop me from walking into his shot. I had to reach Marcus, had to get him out. Whatever else had gone wrong in our relationship, whatever distance had grown between us, he was still my son. And I would die before I let him sit there while a bomb counted down 15 feet away. "Marcus!" I shouted his name, not caring anymore about making a scene, not caring who stared or whispered. He looked up, startled, his face flushing with what I recognized as embarrassment. Vanessa touched his arm, saying something I couldn't hear, her expression darkening as I approached. "Marcus, you need to come with me right now. Don't ask questions, just get up and walk toward the exit." My voice came out harder than I'd intended, the old authority I'd used when he was a boy and had wandered too close to the street or reached for a hot stove. But Marcus wasn't a boy anymore. He was a grown man who'd made it clear he didn't need or want my guidance. "Dad, what are you doing?" He stood up, but it was defensive, not compliant, his body angled to block me from Vanessa. "You're making a scene. This isn't the time for whatever this is." His words hit me like a slap. Even now, even in what might be our final moments, there was that wall between us, that assumption that I was here to embarrass him, or interfere or judge. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, wanted to scream that none of that mattered anymore, that in 60 seconds nothing would matter except whether we were still breathing. Instead, I locked eyes with him and said the only thing I could think of that might cut through his pride and anger. "Your daughter is waiting outside because she's terrified. There's something under the table near where we were sitting, something dangerous. I need you to trust me, just this once, and get yourself and everyone else out of this building right now." I watched his face cycle through emotions, disbelief, irritation, confusion, and then finally, something that looked like the boy I'd raised, the one who used to believe I could fix anything. Vanessa stood up beside him, her voice shrill with indignation. "Are you seriously disrupting our wedding with some paranoid delusion? Marcus, tell your father to sit down or leave." She grabbed his arm, possessive and demanding, but Marcus shook her off, his eyes still on mine. "Where's Lily?" he asked, and I heard it. The first crack in his defenses, the sound of a father's fear overriding everything else. "Outside," I repeated. "Safe for now. But we have less than a minute, Marcus. We have to go." He looked at me for one more agonizing second, and I saw him make the calculation, saw him decide whether to believe his difficult, interfering father, or dismiss me like he'd been doing for 3 years. Then he turned to Vanessa and said, "We're leaving. Tell everyone to evacuate. Now." She started to protest, but something in his voice must have convinced her, because she picked up the microphone the DJ had been using and her voice, amplified and panicked, filled the barn. "Everyone needs to exit the building immediately. This is not a drill. Leave your belongings and move toward the exits calmly but quickly." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The music stopped. Conversations died. Then chaos erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone screamed. The crowd surged toward the doors like a living thing, shoving and stumbling. And I fought against the tide, pushing toward where I'd last seen Lily disappear. Marcus was beside me suddenly, his hand gripping my elbow, helping me stay upright as bodies pressed around us. "Where is she?" he shouted over the noise. "Bathroom exit, back of the barn," I gasped, my old legs burning with the effort of moving through the crush of panicked guests. We reached the back hallway just as the first people started shoving through the bathroom door. I saw a flash of pink and lunged forward, pulling Lily into my arms as Marcus shielded us both with his body. "I've got you," I whispered into her hair. "I've got you, sweetheart." We stumbled out into the afternoon sunlight, joining the stream of people pouring across the gravel parking lot, putting distance between themselves and the barn. I counted steps in my head, counting down the seconds I thought we had left, wondering if I'd been wrong about the timer, wondering if we'd caused all this panic for nothing. Marcus had Lily now, holding her tight against his chest, and I saw tears streaming down his face as he kissed her forehead over and over. We'd made it maybe 50 yards when the explosion ripped through the air behind us. The force of it knocked me to my knees, a wall of heat and sound that seemed to tear the world apart. I hit the gravel hard, palms scraping, ears ringing so loud I couldn't hear my own scream. Debris rained down around us, smoking pieces of wood and metal, someone's shoe, a chunk of the beautiful barn that had been standing just seconds before. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Lily crying and Marcus calling my name, but it all sounded distant and muffled, like I was underwater. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the blue September sky now streaked with black smoke, and thought, we made it. We actually made it out. But as I lay there catching my breath, as the initial shock started to fade and reality came crashing back, one question burned through everything else, drowning out even the relief of survival. Who was that man at the door, and why did he want my son's wedding to end in fire and blood? The grass beneath my back was wet from yesterday's rain, seeping cold through my shirt as I struggled to catch my breath. Around me, chaos painted itself in screaming colors. Women in cocktail dresses stumbled across the gravel lot, their heels broken, mascara streaming down ash-covered faces. Men shouted into cell phones, demanding ambulances, police, someone to make sense of what had just happened. The barn, that carefully restored piece of rustic charm Vanessa had insisted was perfect, burned like a funeral pyre, flames clawing at the darkening sky, black smoke rolling across the parking lot in choking waves. I pushed myself up on shaking arms, my vision swimming, tasting blood and dust, searching desperately through the crowd for the two people who mattered most. Marcus knelt 20 feet away, his expensive suit torn at the shoulder, Lily wrapped so tightly in his arms I couldn't see her face. He was rocking her, whispering something I couldn't hear over the roar of the fire and the wail of approaching sirens. Relief flooded through me so intensely my eyes burned with tears I didn't have the strength to hide. They were alive. We were all alive. I'd gotten them out in time, and whatever else happened now, whatever consequences came from the decision I'd made to trust my instincts and cause that panic, at least my family was breathing. At least my granddaughter wouldn't learn what it felt like to burn. I staggered to my feet, legs trembling like a newborn colt's, and made my way toward them. Marcus looked up as I approached, and something in his expression stopped me cold. It wasn't gratitude I saw there, or relief, or even the shock I would have expected. It was fear, raw, wild fear that seemed aimed directly at me. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse. "How did you know?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications I was too exhausted to fully process. How had I known? Because a 5-year-old child had been brave enough to tell me something was wrong. Because I'd looked where others wouldn't. Because I'd trusted my gut instead of dismissing what I'd seen as impossible. "Lily saw the bag first," I said, dropping to my knees beside them, reaching out to touch my granddaughter's hair, needing the physical confirmation she was real and whole. She told me to look under the table. I saw the wires, the timer. There was a man watching Marcus. A man in a dark jacket by the entrance. When I saw the bomb, he was staring right at me, and then he held up his phone to show me the countdown and walked out before it went off. I watched Marcus's face as I spoke, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his jaw clench and his eyes go distant with some emotion I couldn't name. Recognition, maybe. Or dread. "What did he look like?" Marcus asked, and there was something wrong with how he asked it, something too careful, too controlled for a man who just escaped death by seconds. I described what I could remember: the dark jacket, medium build, maybe 40 years old, clean-shaven with close-cropped hair, nothing particularly distinctive except for those eyes, cold and calculating, watching the room like a predator watching prey. Marcus's grip on Lily tightened until she whimpered and squirmed, and he loosened his hold with visible effort, his hands shaking. "Marcus," I said slowly, "do you know who that was?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood abruptly, lifting Lily with him, and started walking toward the growing crowd of survivors gathering near the road. I followed, my heart sinking with every step, because his silence told me everything his words wouldn't. My son knew something about this. Maybe not everything, maybe not the whole terrible truth, but something. The sirens grew louder, and the first fire truck screamed into the parking lot, followed by police cars and ambulances, their lights painting the smoke red and blue. Paramedics swarmed the crowd, checking for injuries, separating the wounded from the merely shocked. One of them tried to steer me toward an ambulance, but I waved him off, keeping my eyes locked on Marcus's back as he wove through the chaos. Then I saw her, Vanessa, sitting on the bumper of someone's car, still in her elaborate wedding dress, now torn and stained with dirt and soot. She was surrounded by her family, her mother clutching her shoulders, her father pacing and screaming at a police officer about security and lawsuits and how this never should have happened. But Vanessa herself sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, her face blank in a way that sent ice down my spine. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look grateful to be alive. She looked, and this was the part that made my stomach turn. She looked almost resigned, like this was something she'd been expecting. Marcus walked straight to her, still carrying Lily, and I hung back just close enough to hear their exchange. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and I heard the strain in his voice, the barely controlled panic underneath the concern. Vanessa looked up at him, and for just a second her mask slipped. I saw fury there, white-hot and venomous, before she smoothed it away and shook her head. "I'm fine," she said flatly. "Your father made quite the scene. I hope he's satisfied now that he's ruined everything." The words were so casually cruel, so precisely calculated to wound, that I actually stepped back as if she'd struck me. Marcus flinched but said nothing in my defense, just shifted Lily to his other hip and looked away. "What would you have done if your own son's wife blamed you for saving everyone's lives? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have said what was burning in your throat?" I wanted to scream at her, wanted to grab her by her expensive dress and shake her until she understood that her wedding, her perfect day, her carefully planned performance meant nothing compared to the lives that would have been lost if I'd stayed silent. But before I could say anything, before I could let the rage building in my chest explode outward, a hand landed on my shoulder. I turned to find a police officer, young and serious-faced, gesturing toward a row of chairs someone had set up for witness interviews. "Sir, I need to ask you some questions about what you saw before the explosion." I let him guide me away, grateful for the excuse to put distance between myself and Vanessa's poisonous stare. The interview was straightforward at first. I described finding the bag, seeing the timer, evacuating the building. The officer took notes, nodding occasionally, asking for clarification on details I could barely remember through the fog of adrenaline still clouding my brain. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Do you have any idea who might have wanted to hurt the people at this wedding?" I opened my mouth to say no, to explain that I barely knew anyone there, that this was my son's second marriage, and I'd been kept at arm's length from most of the planning. But the words died in my throat as fragments of memory started clicking together like puzzle pieces I'd been too blind to see. Vanessa's first marriage that Marcus had never mentioned, the way she'd controlled every aspect of this wedding, insisting on this specific venue, these specific vendors, even the seating arrangements that had put me and Lily near the back, far from the head table. The man at the door who'd watched me with that knowing smile, who'd timed his exit perfectly to be clear of the building before it exploded. The way Marcus had asked how I knew, with fear instead of confusion. The way Vanessa had looked resigned rather than shocked. "I think," I said slowly, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears, "you should ask the bride and groom that question." The officer's eyes sharpened with interest. "Why do you say that?" "Because something was wrong here. Something that went deeper than a random act of violence or a targeted attack. This felt personal, planned, and the two people at the center of it, the two people who should have been most devastated by their wedding exploding into flames, both seemed more angry than afraid." "Just a feeling," I said finally, not ready to voice the terrible suspicions forming in my mind without more evidence. But I'd talk to them carefully, and I'd check their backgrounds thoroughly. The officer made a note and asked a few more questions before releasing me with instructions not to leave town. I stood and walked back toward the crowd, scanning for Marcus and Lily, needing to see them again, to hold them and convince myself they were truly safe. I found them near Marcus's car, Lily asleep in the back seat despite everything, her small face peaceful in a way that broke my heart. Marcus leaned against the driver's door, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. I approached quietly, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to stop myself from listening. "I don't care what you have to do," Marcus hissed into the phone. "Make it go away. All of it. The records, the connections, everything. My father's already asking questions, and if the police start digging—" He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end, and when he spoke again his voice cracked with desperation. "You promised me this wouldn't touch us. You promised if I went through with this we'd be clear. But now there's a bomb. My daughter almost died and my father saved everyone and I can't. He broke off, pressing his forehead against the car window, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood frozen, barely breathing, as the world tilted sideways around me. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised to value honesty and integrity above all else, was involved in whatever had happened here. Not a victim. Not an innocent bystander caught in someone else's violence. Involved. Connected to something dark enough that bombs were being planted at weddings and records needed to disappear. Every instinct screamed at me to confront him, to demand the truth, to shake it out of him if necessary. But something held me back, some deeper knowledge that if I pushed now, while he was fragile and exposed, I might lose him forever. Instead, I cleared my throat softly, giving him warning before I stepped fully into view. Marcus jerked upright, shoving the phone into his pocket, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Dad," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just checking on some work stuff, making sure they knew I wouldn't be in tomorrow." The lie sat between us, obvious and painful, but I didn't call him on it. Not yet. Not when my granddaughter slept 10 feet away and the barn still burned behind us and police officers interviewed shell-shocked guests about the worst day of their lives. "We should get Lily home," I said instead, keeping my voice gentle, non-threatening. "Rachel's probably seen the news by now. She'll be worried sick." Marcus nodded, relief washing over his face at the change of subject. Yeah, you're right. I'll drive you both back to her place." He moved to open the car door, but I stopped him with a hand on his arm. He tensed under my touch and I felt it like a knife to the gut. This new fear my son had of me, this distance that had somehow become a canyon I didn't know how to cross. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I need you to understand something. Whatever's going on here, whatever you're caught up in, I'm your father. That doesn't change. You can tell me anything, and I'll help you fix it." For just a moment, I thought he might break. Thought he might collapse into my arms like he had as a boy and confess everything, trusting me to make it right the way I always had when he'd scraped his knees or failed a test or had his heart broken for the first time. But then his expression shuddered, walls slamming down, and he pulled away from my grip. "There's nothing to fix, Dad. Someone targeted the wedding. Probably one of Vanessa's ex's family. The police will figure it out. We were just unlucky." Another lie, smoother than the first, delivered with the kind of practiced ease that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had to deceive someone he loved. I wanted to call him out, wanted to tell him I'd heard every word of his phone conversation, that I knew he was drowning in something terrible and didn't have to face it alone. But what came out instead was, "Okay, son, if you say so." Because sometimes loving someone means giving them space to come to you, even when every fiber of your being wants to drag the truth out into the light. We drove to Rachel's house in silence, Lily still sleeping, Marcus's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When we pulled up, Rachel came running out before we'd even parked, her face streaked with tears, and she yanked open the back door to pull Lily into her arms, checking her over with shaking hands. "I saw it on the news," she sobbed, glaring at Marcus over Lily's head. You could have gotten her killed. What were you thinking, bringing her to that woman's wedding? Marcus climbed out of the car, his face pale. Mom, it's not his fault, I started, but Rachel cut me off with a look of pure venom. Stay out of this, William. You always defend him, but look what happens. Look what he's brought into our lives. She turned and carried Lily toward the house, and I watched my granddaughter's sleepy head bob against her mother's shoulder, watched the door slam behind them, shutting us out. Marcus stood beside me in the gathering dark, the smell of smoke still clinging to our clothes, and I realized with awful clarity that I was watching my family splinter into pieces I might never be able to put back together. Somewhere in the distance, more sirens wailed. Back at the venue, investigators would be combing through the wreckage looking for answers, and I stood in Rachel's driveway with my son, both of us keeping secrets, both of us afraid of what the truth might destroy, wondering how long we could keep running from the fire that was already burning everything we'd tried so hard to protect. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I sat in the worn leather chair by my bedroom window, the one my wife used to read in before the cancer took her voice and then her breath, and watched the street outside my house like I was waiting for something inevitable to arrive. Every passing car made my heart jump. Every shadow that moved in the periphery of the streetlights sent adrenaline spiking through my veins. The local news had been playing the explosion on loop since midnight. Aerial footage of the barn reduced to blackened skeleton beams, interviews with guests who'd escaped, speculation about terrorism and grudges and random violence. But they had it all wrong. This wasn't random. This wasn't some outside threat crashing into our lives. This was something we'd invited in, something Marcus had tangled himself up in so thoroughly I didn't know if he could ever break free. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the side table, a text from a number I didn't recognize. You should stop asking questions, old man. You got lucky once. Don't push it. My hands went cold as I read those words again and again, the threat clear despite the casual phrasing. Someone was watching me. Someone knew I'd been talking to the police, knew I'd planted seeds of suspicion about Marcus and Vanessa. I should have been terrified. Should have deleted the message and locked my doors and maybe even left town for a while until this whole nightmare sorted itself out. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a burning, righteous anger that cleared away the fog of exhaustion and grief and gave me perfect clarity about what I needed to do. I needed to protect my family. Not by staying quiet and hoping the danger passed, but by finding the truth and dragging it into the light before it could destroy everyone I loved. I forwarded the text to the officer who'd interviewed me, then started making a list of everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. Vanessa's first marriage and why it had ended. The man in the dark jacket who'd watched the countdown with such satisfaction. Marcus's phone call about making records disappear. The way Vanessa had looked resigned rather than shocked when the barn exploded. Each piece felt significant on its own, but I couldn't yet see how they fit together. Couldn't quite grasp the shape of the monster hiding in the shadows of my son's new life. By dawn, I'd made a decision that would have horrified my late wife but felt absolutely necessary. I was going to break into Marcus's house and search for answers. He'd given me a key months ago, back when things between us were slightly less fractured, asking me to water his plants when he traveled for work. He'd never asked for it back, probably forgot I even had it. I'd use it now not to betray him but to save him from whatever quicksand he'd stumbled into. I showered and dressed in dark clothes, pocketed the key in my phone, and drove across town to the neighborhood where Marcus lived, timing my arrival for mid-morning when most people would be at work and the streets would be quiet. His house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a tidy 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a lawn that needed mowing. Marcus's car wasn't in the driveway, and neither was Vanessa's silver BMW. Good. That gave me time, though I had no idea how much. I parked 2 streets over and walked back, trying to look casual, just an old man out for a morning stroll. The key slid into the lock smoothly, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The house smelled like vanilla candles and coffee, Normal domestic sense that felt obscene given what I was about to do. I started in Marcus's home office, a small room off the living area he'd converted into a workspace when he started his consulting business. His desk was cluttered with papers, client files, invoices for services I didn't fully understand. I rifled through drawers, looking for anything out of place, anything that might connect to the explosion or the mysterious phone call. Nothing. Just boring work documents and old tax returns. I moved to the filing cabinet in the corner, pulling open drawers and flipping through folders labeled with mundane categories like insurance, utilities, warranties. Then in the back of the bottom drawer, hidden behind a stack of old bank statements, I found a folder with no label. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, printed on regular copy paper like someone had pulled them from surveillance footage. They showed Vanessa meeting with various men in parking lots, restaurants, office buildings. In one image, she was handing an envelope to a man I recognized, the same man who'd been watching from the barn entrance, the one who'd shown me the countdown on his phone. My stomach dropped. In another photo, she sat across from someone whose face had been circled in red ink, and written beside it in Marcus's handwriting were the words, "Paul Hendricks, her first husband, released early for testimony." Released early. That meant prison. Vanessa's first husband had been in prison. I pulled out my phone and started photographing every page in the folder, my hands shaking so badly some of the images came out blurred. There were bank records showing large cash withdrawals from Marcus's accounts over the past 6 months. There were emails printed out, exchanges between Vanessa and someone named Derek about the plan and timing, and making sure there's no connection back to us. There was a handwritten note, the paper crumpled like it had been thrown away and then retrieved. That said simply, they promised it would be small, just enough to scare people and collect the insurance. They lied. Before I continue, you need to know that what I discovered next changed everything I thought I knew about my son. If you want to hear how this ends, hit that subscribe button now because the truth is darker than you can imagine. Insurance fraud. That's what this was. Vanessa had convinced Marcus to help her stage an explosion at their own wedding so they could collect on massive insurance policies she'd taken out on the venue, the catering, the gifts, everything. But someone, probably this Derek person or the ex-husband with the prison record, had decided to make it real instead of theatrical, had decided that actual death and destruction would be more convincing than a controlled burn. And Marcus had realized too late that he'd gotten tangled up with people who had no intention of keeping their promises about keeping anyone safe. My son, my brilliant, stubborn, foolish son, had tried to commit insurance fraud and ended up nearly killing his own daughter in the process. I sank into his desk chair, the folder falling from my numb fingers, pages scattering across the floor. How had it come to this? How had the boy I'd raised, the one who'd cried when his goldfish died and volunteered at soup kitchens every Thanksgiving, turned into someone who'd risk lives for money? The answer hit me with awful clarity. Desperation. The divorce from Rachel had destroyed him financially. The legal fees, the child support, the cost of starting over in a new apartment while maintaining the house Rachel lived in with Lily. He'd been drowning, and when Vanessa appeared with her connections and her schemes and her promises of easy money, he'd grabbed hold without looking closely enough at what he was grabbing. I heard a car door slam outside and froze. Footsteps on the front walk, a key in the lock. I had maybe 5 seconds to decide whether to hide or confront, and in that heartbeat of time, I chose confrontation. I gathered up the scattered pages, shoved them back in the folder, and stood to face whoever was coming through that door. It was Marcus. He stopped dead when he saw me, his face cycling through shock, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Dad," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I was hoping you'd figure it out. I've been carrying this alone for so long I don't even know who I am anymore." We stood there in his living room, father and son, separated by years of distance and mistakes, but connected by blood and love and the terrible knowledge of what he'd done. "Tell me everything," I said, and my voice came out gentler than I expected, not the fury I'd thought I'd feel, but a deep, aching sadness for the man my boy had become. Marcus nodded and sank onto the couch, and for the next hour he confessed. Told me about meeting Vanessa at a business conference 6 months after the divorce. How she'd seemed so understanding, so sympathetic to his financial struggles. How she'd introduced him to her business associates who had a foolproof plan for making quick money. It was supposed to be simple, Marcus said, his voice hollow. Set up a small electrical fire in the kitchen area after everyone had left the reception. Make it look accidental. Collect the insurance and split the payout. Vanessa said she'd done it before with her first husband. That's how they'd gotten caught and why he'd gone to prison. But she'd learned from their mistakes. She said this time would be different. He laughed bitterly. I was so desperate, Dad. So tired of drowning in debt, of disappointing everyone, of being the failure who couldn't even keep his marriage together. I thought this one thing, this one terrible choice, would fix everything. But they changed the plan, I said, piecing it together. The people Vanessa was working with decided a real explosion would be more profitable. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. I found out 2 days before the wedding. Vanessa told me it was too late to back out, that her ex-husband's associates were handling it now, and if I tried to stop it or warn anyone, they'd kill me and go after Lily. She said the explosion would happen after the reception ended, when the building was empty. She promised no one would get hurt. His voice broke completely. But then you and Lily were there, and I realized these people didn't care about promises, and I didn't know how to stop it without getting us all killed. I sat down beside him, the weight of everything crushing down on my chest. Marcus, do you understand what you've done? People could have died. Your daughter could have died. He nodded, sobbing openly now. I know. And I've been living in hell knowing that I brought this on all of you. When you pulled us out, when you saved everyone, I thought maybe I could just let it go, let the police think it was random violence, and we'd all move on. But then you started asking questions, and I knew you wouldn't stop until you found the truth. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. What do I do, Dad? How do I fix this? There was only one answer, and we both knew it, even if saying it out loud would destroy everything Marcus had left. You go to the police, I said firmly. You tell them everything you just told me. You testify against Vanessa and her associates. You take whatever punishment they give you, and you spend the rest of your life making this right. Marcus flinched like I'd struck him. I'll go to prison. I'll lose my business, my house, any chance of custody with Lily. Rachel will never let me near her again. Every word he said was true, and each one felt like a knife in my gut. But the alternative was worse. If you don't come forward, I said, these people will own you forever. They'll use you for the next scheme and the next, and eventually someone will die, and you'll be responsible. Is that the man you want to be? Is that the father you want Lily to remember? The question hung between us, and I watched my son wrestle with the hardest choice he'd ever have to make. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Okay, I'll do it. But I need you to promise me something. I waited, afraid of what he might ask. Promise me you'll be there for Lily, that you'll explain to her when she's old enough to understand that I loved her more than anything, even if I made terrible mistakes. The request broke something inside me that I didn't know could still break. I promise, I managed, pulling him into a hug the way I had when he was small, and the world seemed too big and scary. I promise, son, and I promise I won't abandon you either. I'll be at every court appearance, every parole hearing, every step of whatever comes next. You're not alone in this. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the morning light stretched across his living room floor, two broken men trying to find a way forward through the wreckage of choices that couldn't be undone. 3 days later, Marcus turned himself in. I sat beside him in the police station while he gave his full confession, naming names, providing evidence, cooperating completely with investigators who promised to consider his cooperation during sentencing. Vanessa was arrested the same day, along with her ex-husband Paul and 2 other men involved in planning the explosion. The news coverage was brutal. My son's face appeared on every channel, labeled as a conspirator in attempted insurance fraud and reckless endangerment. Rachel called me screaming, saying she'd never forgive me for not stopping him sooner, for not protecting Lily from having a criminal for a father. But through it all, I kept my promise. I visited Marcus in jail while he awaited trial. I hired the best defense attorney I could afford, spending the retirement savings my wife and I had built over 40 years. I testified as a character witness, telling the court about the good man my son had been before desperation led him astray. And when the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison with possibility of parole after 3, I was there in the courtroom, watching him be led away in handcuffs, watching him mouth "I love you" before the doors closed behind him. Now 8 months later, I sit with Lily every Sunday afternoon in my backyard. We plant flowers and read books, and slowly, carefully, I'm teaching her that people she loves can make terrible mistakes and still deserve forgiveness. She asks about her daddy sometimes when he's coming home, if he still thinks about her. I tell her the truth in words she can understand, that he made a bad choice, but he's working hard to be better, that loving someone means staying even when things are hard. She doesn't fully grasp it yet, but someday she will. Someday I'll show her the folder I kept from Marcus's office, and I'll explain how I chose to help him face the consequences of his actions rather than run from them, because that's what real love looks like. The lesson I learned through all of this, the one I hope stays with anyone who's heard this story, is that protecting the people you love doesn't always mean shielding them from pain. Sometimes it means walking with them through the fire they started, holding their hand while they face the consequences, and refusing to let them carry the weight of their mistakes alone. Marcus will be released in 2 years if his behavior stays good. He writes to Lily every week, letters I read to her before bed, rebuilding their relationship one carefully chosen word at a time. And me? I'm just an old man who made the hardest choice of his life in that barn when I decided to save everyone, including the son who'd put them all in danger. I'd make the same choice again without hesitation, because that's what fathers do. We save our children, even from themselves. I'm reading and replying to every comment under this post. Tell me, would you have turned in your own child, or would you have tried to hide the truth to protect them? There's no right answer, but I want to know where you stand. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about love and consequences and the impossible choices families face, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. Because life keeps teaching me lessons I never wanted to learn, and sometimes sharing them is the only way to make sense of the wreckage we leave behind.